Hi, everybody. Happy Thursday. I am Emma. I am dog sitting for my sister. How's your Thursday going? Because this dog is ammo, ammo, ammo. I'm dog sitting for my sister. Hey, no, you're done. Goodbye. He's a German Shepherd and he's still like a puppy. So he is all energy, and I'm watching him for my sister. And he's been fine. He's been napping. And naturally, when I go to do this live, is when he decides to get out his little dinosaur squeaky toy and go berserk. So you will likely see bits and pieces of Ammo, the German Shepherd, throughout the video. You'll probably hear him squeaking his toys. It's okay. It's all okay. So, welcome back to the IB Book Club. I am super excited for chapter 6. I think I accidentally put chapter 7 in this title of this video, but it is chapter 6. Um, this was a really, really good chapter, I think, because I'm one of those people, and please let me know in the comments that I'm not by myself. Um, I don't really trust a lot of big name Christian writers, and I know that sounds so terrible. But a lot of times when they have really big names, they have really big platforms, really big churches, really, let's just be blunt, really big bank accounts, really big houses. I'm just like, I don't I don't know how I feel about your what I call Jesus words. Like I don't know if I trust necessarily where you're coming from. I don't really know how much faith you even have to have day in and day out because of how your life looks. And I think in this chapter, Lysa Terkeurst, who is a big name, I think for the first, not even the first time in this book, but I think this chapter is where I finally was like, you know what? Yeah, she has a huge social media platform. Yes, she probably makes really good money on these books. Yes, she is the founder of a huge ministry. Yes, she is a household name in the Christian world. But she is being so vulnerable in this chapter that she now feels like a writer I trust. Like she's sharing enough of herself and enough of not the big and glamorous fancy parts of her life that I'm like, okay, no, she's lived through hard stuff and I can take her Jesus words to heart. So I don't know if any of you guys have kind of ever felt that way where there's big name people in the Christian world and you're like, I don't know how I feel about you. Like, honestly, what in your life has been so terrible that I can trust your concept of faith and walking through hard things. But I think this chapter sealed the deal for me with Lysa and just feeling like she's an author that I can trust. Um, so before we get into like the actual nitty gritty of the book, please in the comment section let me know your first name and where you're watching from. It's really neat because I mean I'm from the US. I'm a States girl, but like last week I made friends with a lady who lives in Israel. And now we're on social media together and we get to encourage each other. And so it's really cool to see whether you're, in the States, if you want to tell me what state you're from, or if you're international and you're in a different country, it's really cool to see how we can get on this platform and connect. So again, if you'll just let me know your first name in the comments and let me know where you're watching from. And also please click the subscribe button. I know we're kind of trying to get the right day and the right time down for the IB Book Club as far as the most optimal time when we can get the most people on live. Because I know that, I mean, weekdays, everyone has work and all sorts of things. But if you will subscribe, when I click, hey, we're going live at this day, this time, boom, you'll get the notification. So it's almost like a Google Calendar sort of thing. If you go ahead and subscribe, you automatically get all the notifications and you get synced on our calendar events. So while I'm changing dates and times for the next few weeks, trying to figure out how to optimize our time together, you won't have to constantly search through YouTube or feel like you just have to stalk the page. You'll get a notification. So, okay. So we're actually going to get into chapter 6 now. Again, if this is your first time watching, we are going chapter by chapter through Lysa Terkeurst's book from 2020, Forgiving What You Can't Forget. I personally think the cover is stunning. Um, but chapter 6 is talking about connecting the dots. And I think that's a phrase we're all familiar with. I think a lot of us, at least in American culture, we're like, when we're trying to decide how to figure something out or how this relates to that, we're like, okay, let's connect the dots here. What are the similarities? How do point A, point B, and point C all actually intertwine? So she opens this chapter talking about the last chapter. And so if you haven't had a chance to read chapter 5, it's a doozy. It walks through Lisa's vulnerability in that she shares how her dad walked out and left her when she was young and never came back. She she talks about her grandmother's neighbor who sexually molested her, abused her. And so she talks about how men in her life constantly made her feel that she wasn't safe, that she wasn't protected, that she couldn't really trust anyone. And so she circles all of that back to this next chapter. And so she opens chapter 6 with saying that she actually called a good friend of hers and walked her through chapter 5, like actually verbatim out loud on the phone, read all of chapter 5, which was all the big nasty details of the way she was hurt by so many men growing up. And she's saying in this chapter, the current chapter, while she's reading that on the phone to her friend, she has no idea that Art, her husband, was in the next room listening. And once, she hangs up the phone and is finished talking with her friend, her husband, Art, comes in there and he sits down beside her and he was just like, that was a really good chapter. And she said, you could kind of see tears in his eyes. And she said there were actually very few times in their marriage where she ever remembered Art, her husband, crying. Like, I think she said there were 4 times before this. But to see him listen to her open up, even though she wasn't technically opening up to him, she was talking to a friend on the phone, to hear just how hurt she's been in her life. And then for him to kind of know that, of course, he never just up and left her, he never sexually abused her, but when he ran around on her and when he was unfaithful in their marriage, he literally became just another man in the lineup, like another man that she probably had a really good reason to not trust. He became another reason she was probably very wary of opening herself up to much of anybody, because the main men in her life who should protect and love her were the total opposite. But here he is, just kind of having to swallow his pride and know that he's played a part in this awful lineup of the trauma and the heartache she's experienced. He chooses to come in there and let her know that he heard all that and that he thinks what she's written is beautiful, and he's crying. And Lisa says this sort of moment is something they never had prior to his, when he was being unfaithful, and then they had to go through counseling and they had to unearth all of their heartaches and issues they had. They went to counseling separately, so all the issues they had separately as individuals. And Lisa kind of dives in there on the top of page 74. She talks about how in her family growing up, everything was loud. Like if there was an issue, there was just yelling, there was just fighting. And Art grew up with the thought or the belief that you're just supposed to be quiet. Like silence is strength. If you have to talk about your emotions, there's an issue. So as long as you keep your mouth shut, as long as you can act like everything's fine, then things are fine. And so she said for pretty much all of their marriage up until the the infidelity and the counseling, they both just kind of played this awkward unspoken game of tug of war where she was constantly pulling him towards, "Hey, just talk. What's going on? Be honest, be vulnerable. Talk, talk, talk." And he is on the other end pulling against that, just saying, "Why do you feel the need to talk about everything?" Like, no. No, that's not healthy. That's not how things work. But at the bottom of 74, Lysa says, Art couldn't understand why I was so loud. I couldn't understand why he was so quiet. We were just two people crying for more emotional depth, but had not a clue how to get there. Love is a thing of depth. When forced to stay on the surface, it flounders about like a fish out of water. A fish can't live on the surface because it can't breathe. It breathes oxygen, but not from the surface air. Fish pull water through their gills, which dissolve the oxygen from the water and dispense it into their bodies. If they don't get below the surface, they will be starved of what gives them life. Love is a bit like that. Love needs depth to live, honesty to grow, and trust to survive. And so I just thought that was really powerful. I always thought like fish just needed air to breathe, and they just God just made them where they could get it underwater. But no, they actually need the air that is found inside the water. They have to be in the water to get air. Like they don't necessarily come to the surface and gasp for air and go back down. Some like mammals do, but fish don't. Fish actually need the oxygen that is only found in the H2O in the water. They have to be under the water. And so she pretty much says she and Art had been floundering for years, I mean, decades in their marriage, as far as not really getting the other person and not having mastered communication. And she said what eventually happened is because Art wasn't very open with feelings. He didn't really talk about anything going on, whether it was good or bad. Like he didn't have lots of deep, deep conversation. She said since she was the only one loud and almost aggressively trying to talk about hard things or deep things, she eventually started questioning her own sanity. Like Art doesn't seem to have a problem with X, Y, or Z, but I'm over here yelling and thinking it's the end of the world. Like, am I sane? Am like what's wrong with me? On the inside, I feel a ton of fear. I know something's off. He's not talking, but I can't understand why he's not talking. And all along, deep down, she knows that she kind of has her own issues as well. And I don't know. I think this is where a lot of us sit when we're not willing to communicate with other people. I think what happens is when we don't understand where the other person is coming from, we do one of two things, if not both. And I think honestly, we usually do both. We kind of start blaming the other person because we don't understand where they're coming from. And so the only perception we have of a situation is how we perceive it. And more often than not, we tend to protect ourselves. When we situation, we usually see how we did things right, how we showed up. And then the second thing, which usually follows, especially when we're hurt or confused or scared, is we start nitpicking where the other person didn't show up or didn't do X, Y, or Z, but we did. And so I think that's what happened to her. There was frustration with him, but she was also internalizing the frustration with herself. And so finally, in the chapter, she says the issue wasn't just with Art and the issue wasn't just with her. The issue was that nobody was being vulnerable with the other person. And I feel like vulnerability is almost a catchphrase. It's almost just like a thing you say these days, like, oh, be vulnerable. But vulnerability is hard. It's very hard work. And I think the reality is if a God-fearing woman like Lysa Terkeurst can go through almost 25 years of marriage, never once feeling like she truly tapped into vulnerability, there's a big chance that we're kind of in the same boat. You can love God, you can abide by his word, and you can do your best to love others and still not tap into the depths of truly being vulnerable with other people. And she says on the top of 78, I wanted to know I was accepted. Acceptable and accepted were both feelings we wanted, but the way we went about pursuing those tore us apart instead of bringing us together. The secret to having healthy vulnerability doesn't start with me feeling safe with art. Safety is important for sure, but it doesn't start with others. It has so much more to do with me being safe with me and art being safe with art. It was only when my most honest opinion of myself was also an honoring opinion of myself that I could stand vulnerable before art without fear, without walls of pretension, or curtains that were only open when we performed, with little lies to cover things we couldn't bear to be revealed, without piercing judgments of each other's frailties. Art had to believe he was acceptable, and I had to believe I was accepted. I mean, it's kind of cliche, but if you think about it, like, we're acceptable because of our identity in Christ. There's there's no way around the reality that we're not good on our own, guys. Like, we are really good at getting petty in traffic. We are very good at going to war with other people on social media. Goodness is something we have to work at. And yet God still says we're acceptable, that we're accepted in his sight through Christ's sacrifice. And until we get that down and realize that as who we are, until I say, okay, Peyton, you're acceptable because God has accepted you. And because God has accepted you, you are safe, you are secure, you are loved. Until I get that down, I'm not going to have the humility yet the confidence to be open and vulnerable with another person, because when we don't understand that we are accepted and forever accepted and sealed through Christ, we almost think if we're vulnerable somebody can take a piece of us away. And I think if we've been hurt, which we all have at some point, it makes that process even harder. Like, I don't want to open up and tell you this because you might take that away from me. Or I could give you my vulnerability and you could trample it or you could betray it. And so we love this idea of quietly holding ourselves off from any chance to be hurt. And and while that might seem safe, I think that is your mind truly trying to keep you safe. You just end up bitter because you keep yourself from relationships with humans, and we are made to be in community, but you also never fully tap into the safe, like the so very safe and comforting truth that you are eternally accepted because of Christ. And so when you figure out that your name is reserved in heaven and that you have forgiveness and you are identified by Christ and not yourself, all of a sudden, you know that who you are can't be taken away from you because your identity sealed with Christ. And so you can show up to the table and say very hard, vulnerable, raw, open things. And oftentimes you can say them with grace because I don't want to say once you're okay with yourself, but once you know how to define yourself in light of God and eternity, what you can honestly start doing is seeing the other person that way. And Lysa talks about that in this book, that once she figured out just how acceptable she was, despite the ways all the men in her life had hurt her and the way mankind essentially as a whole had abused her, once she found out that they couldn't take away her worth and her value from God, she was able to see that same truth in her husband Art, no matter what he had done, that in theory should snatch away his good enough card for Christian circles or success in in this life. He was in the same boat as her. He was a believer who was accepted and chosen and sealed for eternity because of his relationship with Christ. And so it's this beautiful, it's almost like this beautiful, I don't want to say two-way street, but it's like this when you're on the highway in a really busy town and there's all of a sudden like 8 lanes that are just wide open and you have so many different options. I think the neat thing is when we know our identity immediately, we can see ourselves with better clarity. We can see our neighbor with better clarity, our boss, and then it's this big list, all these open lanes that we can now cruise down to access forgiveness and even forgiving ourselves. And eventually we even access this lane where we can forgive, start the true journey of forgiving people who've hurt us, people who, when we were vulnerable, they took away a piece of us and we're afraid we'll never get it back. But Lysa makes a really good point to kind of drive this concept home. She talks about how the book of Genesis has really grown her concept of vulnerability. And I don't know that I've ever considered Genesis as a book of vulnerability. I don't know. But she's talking about when God made Eve and she took a piece of Adam's rib, like bone of my bone, and made Eve. And Lysa made the point that Adam wasn't incomplete without Eve. Like Adam was Adam. He was fully accepted, blessed, created, and chosen by God. But the neat thing is when Adam was vulnerable enough that God could take a piece of his rib, when he was totally exposed, and God literally could just snatch a piece of his rib. God said, okay, in your vulnerability, you handed me this tiny bit of a bone. I gave you a helpmate for all eternity. You allowed me to take this one little thing from you, and I didn't really take it from you. I took it and cultivated it into something even more beautiful, and then I gave it right back to you. And that's where Lysa's going with this chapter. It's more so we were, she and her husband were never vulnerable before the affair and all the heartbreaking stuff that goes with it. But now in vulnerability, once she saw who she was in Christ, and once she recognized that Art was the same, he was somebody in Christ, she was able to say, okay, Art can't take away my identity. My father who left me, he can't take away my identity. The man who molested me, he can't take away my identity. My identity is sealed forever because of God. And so what that means is I can give you bits and pieces of who I am. I can show up and be honest and humble and vulnerable and all those things. Because no matter what the other person says or does, my identity is sealed. I mean, of course, you're going to be hurt again in life. That doesn't mean you're going to walk through life unscathed or bulletproof. We're not bulletproof. But what it means is when we know who we are, and that who we are is because of Christ, and it's essentially us and Christ versus the world sort of thing. The world can't ever take what you know to be true. They can hurt you, and you can share and be vulnerable and watch someone just totally abuse that. But the reality is, no matter what you gave to that other person and no matter what they did with it, God's going to take it, and he's going to make it something beautiful, and he's going to hand it right back to you. I think that's the really neat thing I think about the character of God. And I think you see it a lot in the New Testament and the Gospels. While Jesus is on earth, it's like we give him a few loaves of bread and a few fish, and he feeds over 5,000 people. We give him issues and problems, and he turns around and gives us miracles. We give him problems, he gives us solutions. And so I think that's the thing. We give him vulnerability, and we give vulnerability to other people. And no matter what the other people do, because of who we are in Jesus, he still turns around and gives us the miracles. He turns around and gives us the blessings, the solutions. And it's always tenfold. Like we don't even have the capacity to predict just how deep and wide and expansive his love is for us and what he can hand us. And I encourage you to be vulnerable. I know that's, again, it's a very cliche word. I feel like it's often overused, so no one really digs deep on it. But Lysa, on pages 84 and 85, she kind of walks through a checklist of ways for you to look back on your life story, the ways you've been vulnerable and maybe hurt, and see if there are certain, she calls them connections in your story. If there are certain connections or reasons or memories that serve as the reason why you kind of are where you are today, why you might not like to be vulnerable with certain people, why you might avoid, I'll be honest, the church, why you might avoid the church, why you might avoid ever having another romantic, relationship, why you might not ever do this or that, reasons you might not be vulnerable. Like we've got to figure out within our own story why. We can know what happened to us. We can know that we don't like to be vulnerable, but I don't think we'll ever find healing and the willingness to be open and honest and free from bitterness unless we can pinpoint why those situations make us feel the way they do. And so Lisa's checklist is very good. And I personally had things pop in my head, which means I probably have some stuff to work on myself. But she asks, are there times of the day or seasons of the year that you should enjoy but you avoid? So she kind of walks through October, November. She used to love fall. That was her season. But that was when some of the trauma happened with art and all the mess. And she literally has had to intentionally reclaim enjoying fall. She said, reclaiming is so much more empowering than avoiding. Because remember, we talked about earlier in this chat, you can avoid people and avoid being vulnerable and just be quiet and shell up within yourself. And all it does is makes you bitter. And bitterness and loneliness they never have good endings. I've never seen goodness come from people who are both bitter and alone. But the next thing on Lisa's checklist is, are there places you should enjoy, but you find yourself not wanting to go there? I know, I know for me, um, I had a dear friend in high school, and we remained dear friends all throughout college, and we remained friends into early adulthood after college. Um, but we started having differences in, I don't want to say politics because it wasn't that. I don't get into that sort of drama. But we started having different outlooks on life because we were starting to experience different things. And I think one day she just kind of made it known that I needed to stay out of her business and I was no longer a part of her life. And I never really got a full explanation. I was just kind of cut off from her. And I think that broke me in a lot of ways. And I didn't realize it until there's a certain Waffle House restaurant from my hometown that I don't like to go to anymore. And I figured out my why. It's because that's where she and I and one of our other friends would meet up every Wednesday night after classes in college to just catch up. And so maybe you have the same thing. Maybe there's a certain place you just don't go anymore. You're just not about it because there's a certain memory, a certain way someone might have used your vulnerability. And don't just name the place in your head, name why. Like I get it. Waffle House on Commerce Road, don't like it. But why? It's because it kind of reopens that grief of for me mourning a friendship that's lost. She has three other questions. Are there types of people you avoid or find yourself feeling especially anxious around? I actually feel I grew up in a very legalistic church. It was very unhealthy and not based on biblical principle. But I avoid people. I'll be totally honest. I avoid pastors who dress a certain way. If they have a certain look that reminds me of the pastor I sat under, who was so terrible and such a gaslighter, I naturally don't want to be near them. Why? They remind me of spiritual abuse, and I was vulnerable with that pastor and shared some of my concerns and my spiritual struggles, and his lack of God honoring responses, it made me bitter for a while. I was very bitter with church for several years, and I finally worked through that. And I go to church now. My husband and I go. I think it's a huge priority. It's a healthy thing. But to this day, if a pastor looks a certain way and reminds me of that pastor from when I grew up, I won't go near him. It is nothing that person has said or done, but it's almost my brain's defense mechanism. Like, nope, nope, you could be too much like the person who hurt me and made me afraid to go back to church. So, no thanks. Are there certain words or phrases that trigger more emotion than you feel they should? I have a few of those. I don't know. Maybe a lot of times when you have arguments with people you love and you're in the heat of arguing and you start hurling insults or you almost adopt this I'm going to hurt you before you can hurt me, and so you're just cutting each other to the core even after the anger has settled and even after you've forgiven one another. A lot of times there's certain phrases or things they've said that you don't ever forget, and when those certain topics or concepts come up, you just can't open yourself back up to those words because you associate them with a time someone you love cut you to the core. And then our last question is, are there life events that when the memories are talked about, you find yourself wanting to escape the conversation? I don't think any of us human beings could say, "No, I've never had a memory that I just don't want to discuss." But vulnerability, Lisa says at the bottom of 85, there's no performing, no secrets, but it's safe. And I love how she says that. Like, it's vulnerability feels so unsafe because you're exposing yourself to someone else's response. And that someone is someone you can't control. However, when you are willing to be vulnerable with a spouse or with a dear friend or with a spiritual mentor, when you both have that vulnerability because you both see each other through Christ and you understand that the other person can't take your vulnerability and they know that of you, you can just start being honest. You can be a real human being and you can be safe knowing that when you're being a real human being, they're being a real human being and no one's, I mean, I don't like to say you're Superman, but you're almost a Superman sort of thing. Like there's no when God is your savior and you have your identity rooted in him, there's no kryptonite. Even when it's someone else you love who could potentially hurt you, you're like, I mean, you can hurt me, maybe. You can hurt my feelings, you can make me sad. I'm sure I will cry again in this life because of something that happens that's outside of my control, but you can't touch my identity. Like at the end of the day, I can go to sleep knowing who I am and that I am valued and loved. And that's enough to sustain me through hurt. And so I really want to challenge you guys to see vulnerability is a freeing thing, is something that is safe, even though it feels unsafe. And I I don't know. This chapter was it spoke a lot to me. It forced me to unearth some memories in some ways. I've been hurt, and if I'm being totally honest, it's forced me to process some ways I've probably hurt other people and made them feel they couldn't be vulnerable with me. And I think that's a low key part of Lisa's point. At some point, you have to love both the other person, the offender, and love yourself enough to be willing to say, no, I do have an identity in Christ. No matter what anyone does to me, or no matter how I see myself, what I can know apart from feelings in fleeting situations is I'm loved and I'm valued. So that's kind of what I got from chapter 6. It was long. It was definitely a longer chapter, but it was very good. And we will pick up next Friday will be probably on a Friday. Let's shoot for Friday, probably earlier in the morning too. But thank y'all for hopping on a Thursday. I will be off of work tomorrow. So this week was a little bit weird, a little different. But please don't forget again to click the subscribe button just so you can get all the notifications when we go live. If you have any thoughts, inspiration, ideas, please drop them in the comments. Like this video. It lets us know that we're giving you content that you're actually gleaning good things from. It's our way of knowing we're on the right page. If there's something more you want to see or something you're like, no, that's not working, sis, let us know in the comments. But as always, if you don't feel comfortable with that, I will put my Instagram social handle at the bottom, and you can find me on Instagram and message me if you have content you just don't feel as comfortable sharing on the public YouTube comment section. So it's almost Friday. I don't know if you're getting to puppy sit an adorable but mischievous German Shepherd like I am for the long weekend, but I'm cheering you guys on. Be vulnerable with yourself. Be vulnerable with God, and let's see where that takes relationships you weren't sure you could keep afloat or mend. So I'm here if you need anything. Please let me know what we can do for you in this IB book club. Thank you so much for hopping on today. Grab your copy. And until then, we will do chapter 7 next week. I will see you guys soon.